Hey,
How are you?
what's up? How you doing?
Rocking and rolling.
You look professored up right now.
Cool. Thanks. I don't even know what that means.
There's a lot of obviously hype and misinformation that sort of masquerades as science or science backed and whatnot. You know, because we see shit and it's like, and someone talks about a study or something and it's like, it ain't like that though.
Yeah. Well, and as you alluded, the women's health space right now is littered with that. So, and I'm going to be super exciting and say a lot of we don't know, but it's okay.
Well, that's good because there's a bunch of people that go out. Exactly. And that's much different than do XYZ protocol for this specific thing. You know, This changes everything. This is the ultimate routine program protocol when the data ain't there.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, exactly.
All right, welcome to Physiology. I'm very excited to speak with our guest today. She was one of the first people that I thought of talking to when I got this thing started and got this in my head. Dr. Katie Hirsch. Dr. Hirsch, welcome to my living room.
Thank you. It's a very nice living room.
I'm dressed like I'm in my living room and you're dressed like you're in your office. I think it's a good dynamic. But thanks for doing this. Like I said, you were one of the first people that I thought of to talk to because what we're going to talk about today is super interesting. It's really relevant and it's important on multiple levels. So I'm hoping to talk about the topic of female hormones, menstrual cycle, hormonal contraception, in a couple different layers. One of them being the research concern or consideration, what considerations are appropriate, which are not, and how that might affect research results and outcomes. And then also the applied standpoint, both from a practitioner perspective of someone who's working with a female athlete or female client, and then female athletes or female training people in general, and what the current body of evidence and data suggest what is a good practice and what is a good approach to training and menstrual cycle phase and hormonal contraceptions. So hopefully we have a good conversation. I'm sure we will. But before we get there, I do want to ask you, I'm always interested in finding out what led people to the field of exercise physiology, exercise science, nutrition research. So we'll just start there. How did you get into this area of field?
Yeah, super great question. Actually was reflecting on this a little bit, literally just the other day. It's fun to look back on your path, but I think originally when I was an undergrad, I knew I wanted to do something related to sport, exercise, nutrition. But I think as a lot of undergrads, it's not very clear what your options are. And the most visible career is physical therapy. I quickly realized that was not for me, but I didn't really know what all else I could do. I just knew I was very interested in how to maximize my own performance, how I could fuel my exercise, what nutrition did to my body, how I could be healthy. And so kind of every career path I was at least considering was going to require a master's.
Can I jump in and ask you a question?
Yeah.
Okay. What sport did you play, or what sports did you play?
I played all sports growing up. I played volleyball, basketball, and ran. But running was kind of my true love. And so I ran cross country and track in college. So that was really where I was focused. And I wouldn't have said this as an undergrad, but I will say it now. Going to college, really all I wanted to do was run and study how to run fast. So I was typical nerd runner that just wanted to know everything about it. Luckily, the undergrad that I went to had a really good exercise science program that really emphasized undergrad research. So I actually got some really cool opportunities to get involved pretty early on and got exposed to some body comp studies, some nutrition studies, things that later I really specialized in and what I do now. But those kind of planted the seeds. And then when I got to grad school, that was kind of the first time it clicked for me that like research could be my career. I hadn't ever fully considered that before. But just
I'm sorry,
immediately,
where did you do your undergrad at?
I did undergrad at Truman State. It's a Division II school in Northeast Missouri, middle of nowhere. And then I did grad school at University of North Carolina with Dr. Abby Smith Ryan. I did both master's and PhD there. So yeah, when I showed up in Abby's lab, got thrown into that research, and that was just really eye-opening and mind-blowing for me. We were doing body comp assessments, supplement research, nutrition research, interval training, I got exposed to a lot of really cool stuff. And it was really there where I started to take an interest in sex differences and female physiology. It wasn't something I had overtly thought about like deeply like I do now. Until I remember somewhere between my master's and PhD, we did a study with a carbohydrate supplement. And we were testing the supplement in female cyclists. We were basically reproducing a study that had been done in male cyclists. So we were doing it in females. Carbohydrate, the pillar of sport performance nutrition, right? Like the most essential nutrient when it comes to performance. So we did this study, and long story short, like found no effect of any of these carbohydrate supplements. There's maybe a number of reasons why. We can go into that later, but that's not important. But what happened is that just really blew my mind at the time. And it really bothered me. And I just started digging to try to understand why this may have happened, why we didn't see an effect. And very quickly realized there was almost no data in women. I could find almost no studies on female athletes with carbohydrate supplementation. And so, I mean, years later, we finally got some reviews that came out, like I'm going to say in the last few years. Louise Burke's group, I think it was, did some audits of the literature and looked at carbohydrate supplement representation of women, both acutely, chronically, and basically found women are highly underrepresented. And that's consistent across all sport nutrition. So it was that moment, though, that I really was just shocked that our main sport nutrient hadn't even really been studied in women. And it was at that time I was also learning a lot about differences in metabolism between men and women. And that just really bothered me, knowing there were metabolic differences, but we hadn't taken the time to study how nutritional supplementation might vary, and what we might need to just consider. So at the time, there wasn't a ton of female athlete support and research support. And so the way we kind of went about it was doing a lot of sex differences in comparison. So everything I did kind of then on, I really wanted to include males and females. Could I at least kind of see if there were differences in responses that I could then follow up with and say, we need to look at this more closely. Or maybe there wasn't a difference, and that's totally fine too. And so it really wasn't until after I finished my PhD in 2020, started my postdoc after that in Little Rock, Arkansas. That's when kind of the momentum and relevance or just interest in wanting to study women specifically really started to pick up. That's when a lot of the research really got published that said, like, there is huge underrepresentation and we need to pay attention to this. So that really only happened in the last, 4 to 5 years, probably, where that momentum has come from. And so now I almost exclusively look at women for right now, at least, and trying to help fill some of those voids and gaps. So it's been kind of a progression over time, but that's kind of my story of where I got to now.
Yeah, it's I don't want to say funny, but it's like it honestly is confusing. And we're similar in age and when we got our start in academia and whatnot. But yeah, going up, at least for me, going through my undergrad, master's, in, to be honest with you, PhD, sex differences were acknowledged or mentioned, but not explained, described, elaborated. The implications or potential implications were not discussed. It was just, there's males and there's females.
Yeah.
And, there was not even much of a consideration for just the flawed approach of research. I mean, there's a couple things there, but like you're mentioning, females are underrepresented in our field, with a lot of fields as well, right? But the idea, or what we kind of took, was all these data in males and just assumed that they could be translated to females, which maybe some can, maybe there are no differences there, but maybe there are some differences there. But the fact that we didn't know that, but still translating male research into female application, is just, now thinking about it and being made aware of it by people like yourself, it's really like, how'd that shit happen? You know what I mean? And I understand the thing of like studying females is hard, because it is, and there's research on that, there's papers on it, and that sort of thing. But yeah, I think
here's my argument there. And I don't disagree. We say it's hard, but I like to flip that script just a little bit. And it's only hard because we haven't been doing it. We've spent years refining methodology to study men because we just now decided to actually study women. I think we just haven't fully addressed how to do it well, what needs to happen to do it well. So right now, I think it seems hard and it presents challenges just because it's a little bit different than what we've been doing for all of history. So that I like to flip that just a little bit. I think we just are facing a new challenge, or just something different that is just challenging how we think about stuff a little bit.
No, that's fair. Maybe hard is not the right.
You can.
Well, it isn't the right way. It's not the right way to put it. New.
It's new. New. There you go.
And then perceived hard. Yeah, I mean, when I'm working on a project right now, that creatine and insulin sensitivity, blood glucose study, and when we were thinking about including females, which we wanted to do, all right, how do we do this? All right, let me email Katie. Right. So thank you for that. But
absolutely.
Maybe let's stick on that point. What potential concerns or limitations or things that should be considered when looking at research and thinking about things like comparing males to females? We can maybe start there. And then differences in menstrual cycle phase. And then just to add another one, because why not? The use of hormonal contraceptions. So maybe just like from a research approach, why? Because some people might think like, well, why is that important? Right. So maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah. So starting from like 10,000 feet, something I like to first emphasize with my students when I talk about like sex differences and female considerations is the like basic aspects of physiology and nutrition like still apply. It's not like we're talking about entirely different systems of operation. It's not like glycolysis drastically changes. Carbohydrates, still foundational, protein, still needed, fat, still important. So the basics like still apply. We're not talking about a black and white situation here. Where it starts to get nuanced is we do notice there's some slight differences in percent usage of carbohydrates during different exercise intensities, different percent contributions of fat at different exercise intensities. And where the big difference between males and females is going to be the sex hormones, which is going to influence all aspects of physiology. Those are systemic hormones, mostly impacting reproduction, but as we know, impacting muscle, cardiovascular, all aspects of physiology. So that's where we tend to focus on that part. And so then females, we could just look at it from that piece. What effects do estrogen, progesterone have just in general? So compared to testosterone, and there's advantages there. Testosterone promotes all things strength, speed, power, whereas estrogen, progesterone tends to promote more endurance. And so that's where we start to see like performance differences, and all those things play out. Where female phys, I think, gets tricky, and where people start to ask a lot of questions is we're not dealing with a stagnant hormone environment anymore. In males, there's some fluctuation as well, but it's generally a lot more stable, and it's especially a lot more stable all across the lifespan. The difference with females is we get a 28-ish day cycle, and with pretty considerable variability in those sex hormones throughout all of that. That tends to change. That happens every month. There's variability month to month on what that looks like. And then as we move through life, what that cycle looks like also changes. So every single female is going to go through puberty, starting that menstrual cycle. And then as you get to that 40s, 50s, perimenopause starts to hit, and that cycle is no longer regular. You get a lot of highs and lows. And then once we hit postmenopause, all of it flattens out. Those are three entirely unique hormone profiles. Whereas men, it's just this gradual decline in it, but it generally looks the same. Then if you throw in pregnancy, you get that wildly different profile. And then if we do the contraceptions, those are wildly different profiles. And so all of that means the potential for variability in what a female's experiencing and how that's impacting her physiology, because that's totally changing what that environment looks like. And so I think that's where a lot of the interest and questions with research lies right now is how much does that variability matter? What does it matter for? Who does it matter for? And then what do we need to do to adjust or make a difference? So I forget what the original question was, but that's kind of the broad things that most people have a lot of questions on, and where a lot of the research, I think, is trying to learn and figure out. I think also too, sorry, this thought just came.
Yeah.
I think with research too, what's tricky, before we used to just kind of, lump individuals like all women into one group, but it's that recognition that that profile isn't consistent across all these different groups. And so how do we in research then account for that? Do we split everybody into different groups? Can we lump them all together? Or how do we account for that difference in variability? There's a lot of questions and things there. And when we think about research cost and time and funding, that can get tricky. And I think a lot about like, how do we progress the field forward and help catch this info up? We can't just keep slicing the population into smaller and smaller groups. And so there's a lot of consideration of like, when do we need to parse it down to something that small and that specific? And when is the question something we can be more inclusive? All considerations. I think I opened just like 50 cans of worms, but
Yeah. When we were in Colombia, I mentioned this to you because it had just come out, but that D'Souza paper, all right, thanks to Phillips is on it, Elliott Sale, and a bunch of other big names on it. At that point, I kind of had just skimmed it, and I just want to know what you thought about it, but I don't think you had read it at that point. But I revisited it, and kind of to the points that you made here. One, we don't quite know a lot of things, but in terms of when those inclusion exclusion considerations come into play, from what the little data there are, and going off this review, and they did a meta-analysis for a couple of different outcome variables, but they didn't see too much of a difference in substrate use, oxidation, or metabolism. I think some vascular stuff, and then also exercise performance, and then hypertrophy, that they didn't see too much evidence. And again, it's very, very limited. So, they preface their conclusions in that way. Given the current limited evidence, it doesn't seem to suggest, at least as of now, that there's too much of a difference specifically relating to menstrual cycle phase and then the use of oral contraceptions between users and non-users. Because the question would be not just from how do we research a specific thing like carbohydrate loading or supplement study or training study, efficacy of a training program, but then also like what does that do for, how do we think about the past research that did study females, right? Because if they didn't count or classify or validate menstrual cycle phase, well, are the results confounded then because on one trial they were in the luteal phase and then another trial they were in a follicular phase? Could that have affected the results? Or some of the subjects were using oral contraception and others weren't. So I think, those are important questions, but maybe how do you think about that in terms of how to approach future research questions relating to exercise physiology, performance, nutrition in females? And then I'd be interested in this one too, is how do you think about past research on females?
Well, I'll start with the past research. I'm almost always in the camp of we can't just dismiss everything from the past. I think that research still has validity. And I think it really depends on what the question was. And I think it also, like, that's what helps complete this whole bigger story we're trying to tell. Just for example, no joke, I've been thinking pretty deeply about some menstrual cycle related data and was literally deep in some studies that were done. One was done in the 1920s, one was done in 1982, which isn't like that terribly old, but a lot of students think like, oh, we should only look in the last 5 to 10 years. Like if it wasn't recently done, it's probably outdated. And that's just not necessarily true. And it's good to be able to look back and evaluate, like maybe the question was still good. The technology just maybe wasn't as sensitive, but there's still some good data to be had back there. So I think those studies that were being done, honestly, as I was reading some of them, like I didn't think they were that terribly done. And they were honestly doing some pretty impressive, like serial assessments. So I don't think we should ever fully be dismissive of past research. And I think there's things we can learn from that. And there's still like good evidence of sex differences. Which then I think what we tend to see
Can I
a
add
lot of
something?
times. Yeah.
Okay. Were you at the ACSM, American College of Sports Medicine annual meeting in 2020? I can't remember if it was 22 or 23, where Dr. Elliott Sale was presenting her audit of the female nutrition research.
Maybe. I've heard her talk a few times, so I can't remember which one I've.
It was in San
Yeah.
Diego. Were you in San Diego?
Probably. Yeah. I should have been
Okay.
there.
Yeah. So she presented that paper that came out 22 or 23. And
Yeah.
essentially, like you mentioned earlier,
Yeah. Yeah.
showing
Yeah.
that there's underrepresentation, and then also
Yeah.
the classifying or the consideration or the reporting
Yeah.
of hormonal menstrual cycle contraception status is like very, very low. And she
Well,
had
and
these
so,
different tiers,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Gold level. And
Yep.
I felt like there were a lot of people that were like, damn.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Which I know that wasn't
Yeah.
her intent. But she
No,
was just
and that's
giving an
what.
evaluation of the body of literature.
Yes, yes, yes. And she was asking a very specific question, which I think a lot of people forget. She was very specifically evaluating difference between different phases of the cycle. And what you find when you go back to prior menstrual cycle research, it is hard to parse out sometimes. They say follicular phase. Does that mean early in the follicular phase? Does that mean later in the follicular phase? That looks different from a hormone standpoint. Or if we say luteal, does that mean earlier, middle, late? Are we sure that they ovulated and progesterone got higher? And so when she was trying to make this very specific assessment, and you really start digging into research, and you know this, as someone that reads studies all the time, the more you really start to tear studies apart and you really start looking at them and you're trying to like pick out these very specific pieces, that starts getting in that scenario very, very hard, because a lot of studies weren't defining that, and they weren't very clearly making sure certain time points happened or were accounted for. And there's the recognition of that the menstrual cycle is highly variable. It's highly individualized. It's highly variable month to month for an individual. And there's a lot of women that don't have a stereotypical looking cycle. And so maybe before we were lumping a lot of things together and trying to ask a very specific question, but adding a whole lot of variability. So that would be a scenario where we want to maybe be more specific, and maybe we weren't. And so again, doesn't mean that data was bad. It's just recognizing to answer this very specific question, we maybe needed a little bit more control to tease out the variability. Because what you see in general, female studies, there's a lot of variability in the measure, probably somewhat due to those hormonal variability. And so when we're already dealing with extra variability and then trying to measure a within individual variability, we just start adding a lot of variability to the measure, which makes it hard to tease out a difference. And so I think, to her point, if that's the question, and if we're really going to tease that out and understand how much of an effect those hormones are having, we need to be having a little bit better methodology to fully account for that. And we can't just make assumptions that like had maybe been happening. Where that gets tricky, and where I think what we're seeing in the data right now, so we're trying to improve that quality. But the conclusion right now is that there's not a lot of variability in physiology across the cycle, or maybe we'll say in performance, because that's where a lot of the bigger focus has maybe been. There's some physiological differences, but a lot of times it's hard to tease out. And I think a product of that is, what method are you using to define these phases? How big of a window can you get your people in that time? variability in that even measurement of the hormones. We're still just not quite at in my opinion, methodology standpoint to all the way be maybe precise to the level that we need to be to really tease out that effect, which then I can flip the coin then and say, if I have to be that precise and that specific to see this effect, how much of an effect is it? So that's one piece of it, is if I have to, dig and be that precise, does it translate to this bigger recommendation that needs to be made, or this bigger fact that something's changing across the cycle? But if that might be true for the average person. If I'm an athlete, though, trying to squeeze out, some of these athletes in the Olympics right now winning by hundredths, thousandths of a second, if I'm trying to squeeze out that could be a little bit important, that I account for some of that. And what can I do to maximize my physiology in that moment? So I think thinking about who that matters for, how much of an effect we're chasing, is all really important. And then the last piece I'll add on to that, even though right now a lot of the data, maybe performance-wise, we're not seeing big differences across the cycle, or we're still not quite sure how much of an effect. Just to throw a caveat on it all, if you ask most women if they notice changes in their performance, upwards of 90% say yes. So that's where I think it gets hard, is we're getting this lived experience that says something's happening, but from a scientific measurement standpoint, it's not always as clear and clean cut. And so I think that's why right now a lot of the recommendations are, it has to be, there's not a broad recommendation for all women yet. It's more individualized, and we can dig into that. But right now it's hard to tease out just because there is a lot of variability.
Right. And I do want to get to that. Data research, that's all well and good, but it does not describe the individual. Right. It does not describe the person reading the research paper in order to figure out what they should do. Right. So we'll come back to that and touch on that point. But sticking with the research consideration, and you mentioned this, but can you speak a little more on the potential effect, question, consideration from a research methodological perspective related to contraception, and maybe giving a quick description of the several different ones, because they're different, right? They're different. They may have different considerations.
Yep. Yeah. So contraception, so normal menstrual cycle, estrogen, progesterone start low, estrogen's going to rise, ovulation happens. If ovulation happens, then progesterone also rises. So we get this highs and lows of estrogen and progesterone. When we do, let's say, oral contraception or take the pill, we're exogenously putting estrogen, progesterone in our body, which then kind of overrides the endogenous production to an extent. And instead of getting fluctuations in those hormones, now we get a more steady state level of this now exogenous estrogen, progesterone.
Can I ask a question?
Uh-huh.
So over the course of a month, weeks, whatever, it is a more static, stable level.
It should be very stable. There's variability in that. Most women, I think, are taking a monophasic pill, so it will be the same for the entire month. They're taking the same dose. That dose can vary. depending on what you've been prescribed, but it's the same dose like every day for that active pill phase.
And what about on the daily, on the day-to-day fluctuations with a daily intake? Is there much sort of a fluctuation?
It should be pretty much the same because you're taking the same dose every single day. If that's monophasic, there is biphasic where you go a certain amount of weeks with one dose, and then there's a certain amount of weeks with a little bit higher dose. And then you have a placebo phase where there's no hormone. Or there's a triphasic that tries to kind of mimic a normal cycle. And so there's 3 phases of hormone doses that you would be taking. But basically it's the same dose for however long you're taking. And so you have this, instead of more variability, it should be more consistent.
But it's not something like hour 1 after ingestion where levels are high, and then hour 23, it's markedly lower.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So yeah, you take it high dose on the body, you metabolize it, it's going to drop. And then you take the next dose the next day. So it's just like these little spikes every day within your body, but across pretty stagnant.
Okay. All right.
So that's oral contraception. Let's just stick there for a second. So not to make it complicated. So that profile obviously looks a lot different than a menstrual cycle. And so I always like to just emphasize to my students, when we're talking about menstrual cycles, this does not apply to oral contraceptive users because they now have an entirely different profile that's pretty steady and stagnant. So the question then is that hormone profile tends to be lower and doesn't reach the highs that a regular menstrual cycle might experience. And so the question is, does that have any impact on performance? We're never having those higher rises in estrogen if we're kind of exogenously lowering it. The data there also relatively inconclusive. Suggestive of maybe a slightly lowering performance effect, maybe a little bit lower strength, maybe a little bit lower hypertrophy, maybe a little bit lower endurance, but nothing drastic. And the thing I think I like to pull out of that is, so maybe that matters for an athlete who's trying to really maximize their performance. But if we flip that, if you're an athlete that on a normal cycle experiences a lot of symptoms, so you have a lot of menstrual pain, you have a lot of bloating, you get very heavy brain fog or heavy bleeding, those things are going to impact your performance a lot. And so taking an oral contraceptive might help you better manage those symptoms. So if the contraception helps me lower the symptom that's probably having the biggest effect, that might be a positive trade-off than the little effect it might be having all the way on my performance. Same thing though, sometimes there's side effects with the oral contraceptive and that exogenous hormone. So some women might experience a good amount of weight gain from that, some water retention from that. So that's where finding the right dose, where we're minimizing symptomology ultimately is going to be probably the biggest factor. The other thing, even though maybe there's a little bit of performance variability, there is something to be said about if my profile is consistent, what does that mean for consistency in my training? If I'm no longer having to deal with fluctuations in how my body might be responding, if I'm more consistent, does that mean I can train more consistently and might ultimately be able to get a little more out of it? So that's where that individualized assessment, and that's going to be hard to ever truly tease out, but something, someone might consider with their coach or something of what's going to work best for them. So that's just oral contraceptive pills. Then that's not the only type of contraception. There's IUDs. Those have become a lot more popular. And IUDs are not a systemic hormone. They're only acting locally at the uterus. And so actually the endogenous hormone production with IUD users mimics that of a normal menstrual cycle. And so you still get the fluctuations in estrogen, progesterone. The tricky part about an IUD is that you may not have menstruation, and it may not be obvious anymore, because that's what the IUD is kind of shutting down. And so as far as when we use the menstrual cycle and the period to kind of monitor female health, that might make that a little bit tricky. And so it's hard for those individuals to know, is my cycle normal? They may not know where in their cycle they are necessarily, because you're losing that more physical anchor point with the period. And so that's what makes them maybe a little bit trickier, but they should still be experiencing normal fluctuation in hormone, seeing similar responses to training and exercise and nutrition like a regular individual. So those are the big ones.
Yeah, I've had the thought of, because of that, and also oral contraceptives, because not everyone, takes the placebo pill. They'll just take the active pill throughout.
Right.
But that removes menstruation. And so using that as an indicator of female health, particularly with athletes, like the female triad, that just kicks one leg of the triad out of there. So I'm wondering how that might be revised in the future, because that's a big data point that's not there. Okay. And then just briefly about the copper IUD.
Yeah. So copper, zero hormones even affiliated with that. The copper just makes the uterine environment inhospitable. So there's no hormones going on. So zero change in your fluctuations in hormones. So yeah, they're also going to follow that normal expected fluctuation with the hormones.
All right. I want to ask one last question on research.
Yeah.
At least as of now. If I have more, I'll ask. So when designing a research study and wanting to include females, because like it's been mentioned, very underrepresented in our field, and they're half the population with way less than half of the data, right? How do you think about then the things to control for, the things to consider, and then in terms of, for lack of a better term, defining the women that you are going to use in your study, right? Because like you mentioned, you could get into a situation where you're dividing people, population, into smaller and smaller subsets, right? Females, menstruating females, naturally menstruating females, non-naturally menstruating females, contraceptive users, oral contraceptive, which type, which generation, active, placebo, all of that, right? You're getting into which female subpopulation do you want to study, and then the more, and you mentioned this, right? The more control you have, the less applicability it has to a greater population, right? So how do you think about that when you are designing a research study?
Yeah. I think about all those things. I think first and foremost, kind of blanket, what I try to encourage people to do and what I try to do myself is just describe my population very thoroughly. I think there was a tendency, like I mentioned earlier, to just say healthy females. But I think now we've started to say, okay, can you define that a little bit more? How are you defining that they're healthy? What does their hormone environment look like? Were you positive that they were ovulating? So a lot of times when I'm like reviewing papers or thinking about the research, just did you thoroughly describe and give me as much information as you could about who these women were, just so that maybe you didn't make all the comparisons, but at least if I then go to look at the research collectively, I more clearly know who you were looking at, and I can think about those different pieces. And if that's influencing anything that we're seeing or might influence any of the results. So I think just step one is like clearly describe who you're studying. Were they pre, peri, postmenopause? How did you confirm that? Did you include contraceptive users? If yes, generally what type were they on? Did you control for that or not? Or just tell me what they were on? How did you know if they were regularly menstruating? Did you just ask them if they were regularly bleeding? Did you check that? Did you check ovulation with ovulation kits and all that? So just being as thorough as we can. That's step one. Just describe who you're even studying. After that, I think when we start discussing like how much do I need to control and account for menstrual cycle, I think right now there's been this huge shift of like, I need to count for all of it, and we should be testing at all these time points, and I can only test here or there. And that's not necessarily true, because that doesn't always translate to real life. There's so many scenarios where people are just living throughout that whole cycle, right? We can't always just isolate ourselves to these two specific time points. And so I think if your question is very specifically about how the fluctuation in hormones or these different hormone phases or profiles are specifically impacting the female physiology, or if that's part of your specific question and your primary question, then yeah, we should probably try to better account for that. And control for that. I think the degree that we go on that, what does your population maybe kind of look like? Do I need to be very specific? Can I be very specific? Or like right now, if I'm thinking about a sports team, I've got a collective of females on there that all look a little bit different. And so maybe I try to mimic that group. And I have kind of that mix, and I just want to see generally on a team, what could I expect? So I think we're weighing that of, am I very specifically trying to tease out a specific hormone question? Or do I want to play the slightly more applied question? The other thing I think we can think about is, let's say I want to know, my outcomes may be like something with glycogen storage, which we know maybe might vary based on hormone profile. Can I either make sure I'm testing everybody in a similar hormone profile, or a low hormone profile, or try to, if I want to reduce some of that variability and really tease out something that I know might be impacting that glycogen storage, maybe then I narrow my window and try to test them in that similar hormone environment. Or if we're doing, over time, can I at least test that singular female in a similar time point each time? So maybe I test her every 4-ish weeks. So I'm controlling her hormone profile, so at least that individual is getting tested at similar time points. So I think there's a lot of ways to come at it, and it's just thinking about, what is my question? How much translation do I want? How many people Do I want to include? Can I include? Right now, I'm kind of in the camp of how do I try to include as many people as possible and not be exclusive in who I'm all the way studying. So what we try to do is at least account for some of our key hormone profiles. So we'll do, can I get equal representation of a eumenoric, an oral contraceptive, and maybe IUD users, just because there's not a lot of data on IUD. So understanding, is there even a difference there, or do they really look similar to eumenoric? So we try to, can I kind of like I used to do a sex differences. Maybe we power the study for this bigger collective group, but I can do some exploratory sub-analysis. Am I seeing any trends within these smaller groups to say, well, that's kind of interesting. Maybe we need to explore that. Now our next study is a well-powered, that specific group. I want to see what's going on. So maybe your first question, like, doesn't need to be so pigeonholed, and maybe your next question's a lot more specific. No one research question answers all the questions. So, yeah, that was a lot of pieces, but.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good approach of shooting for a wider group and then look for smaller sub-analyses and see, are there interesting differences between certain individuals in that sample based on those things. But so if I got this correct, you can correct me if I'm wrong. The answer to, or your perspective of how best to study females is to not study females.
Yes.
Right.
Please just study them. Let's start there.
Right.
I don't want to dissuade anybody from studying women.
Yeah. The answer is not just not doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We are past the time point of saying like it's too complicated or we can't do it, or that's no longer an excuse. So yeah, absolutely do it. There's just some things we can do to clean it up a little bit. Yeah, there's absolutely ways to make it feasible and doable.
Right. And I think what you described, that approach, and of course, like you mentioned, there's different approaches, but understanding that it's not going to be as such of a daunting, overcomplicated, complex sort of thing where you got to like reinvent the wheel.
Yeah.
From a methodological standpoint, it's just small considerations or things to consider here and there that still allow you to, get your work done.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
I'm trying to think if there was one more question I had to follow that. Maybe that was it. Oh, I think in with this project that, I reached out to you for, this was going on a year and a half, 2 years ago, it's just going to take a little more time, potentially.
Yep.
This is a master's student, the thesis project, right? And, with a master's student, you only got a little bit of time with them. Yep. And there's only so much you can do. And if you're looking for a specific population, females or otherwise, right? Athletes, good luck getting access to enough athletes for a study in a lot of cases. You might have to spend a little bit more time with your data collection. And what we've done is, that first student, he collected data. It's not enough to publish, but I got another grad student who he's jumping on and he's continuing, and we're collecting more data. Yeah. And just allowing for time, if it requires it, to get enough data so you have a good quality study at the end of it. So, yeah.
Just maybe take slightly more considerations and planning. It doesn't have to be, I think, as you've learned, it doesn't have to be complicated. It can just, if we're going to try to control for phase a little bit or if we're trying to account for that, yeah, we might have to wait a little bit to start someone, or life happens and they can't come in during that phase. So we just have to wait another phase. Um, but
Or here's one, not, and this is a mind shift for me too, I guess, is not assuming every population is as accessible and prevalent as the young, trained, college age male.
yep. Yes, we right now have a study. We're trying to hit a eumenoric group, an IUD group, and an OC group, and yeah, hit a point, moving along well on the eumenoric and oral contraceptive groups, but weren't getting any IUD users. And so trying to think through like, where are those individuals and who are those people? And is that a regional thing, or are we just not hitting those groups of individuals? I think females in general, though, pretty compliant. And I think there's a lot of interest in this information and data. And from my experience, women across the lifespan really like getting that health information. And so I think it helps to be able to share as much as we can with them, and they're excited to get that info and what does it mean. And so we always try really hard to try to encourage more of that, share as much as we can. And they're pretty good about, from my experience, like, yep, hit my period today, or right now we'll say like, not quite in the right time, let's wait another. They're pretty good within reason from my experience.
Right, right. Okay, well, let's shift to the applied stuff. So I want to ask you, because this is something that gets some attention, I believe, of this idea of, say, phase-based training, or training differently because of some hormonal contraceptive use. Like we had mentioned, the data that do exist, and it's very limited at this time, do not suggest that there's too much of a difference between phases and at least oral contraceptive use. However, I think the D'Souza paper and some others, I think maybe one or two Elliott Sales papers kind of came away with this as well, of there might be some decrement in performance. There might be, right?
Yep.
However, it's not something to where you should approach a female based on the fact that they're using oral contraceptives, that you therefore should expect this decline in performance or some difference in training adaptation, right? So there's two levels, and this comes into play with, this is something we talk about with students, right? Of reading a research paper and then how to apply it in practice, right? So there's not data to say at a group standpoint, at a group level, approach these types of people X way or Y way, right? Based on menstrual cycle phase or contraceptive use. However, at the individual level, they, like you said, right, they may feel differently, fatigue, bloating, cramping, whatever the case is, right? So at the individual level, you may have to approach or train differently, but that's different than given the fact
Everyone
that they're
should train like this on this day.
Or only looking at that data point of she's in this phase or she uses oral contraceptives, therefore I'm going to train this way. So can you speak to how to approach training or working with a female, either an athlete or just someone who recreationally is training?
So the way lately I have been thinking about this and how I like to explain it, because it is confusing. There's a lot of stuff out there that's like, do phase-based training and you should do high intensity stuff at this time on this day. And it's not that clear cut. The way I see all of this, and so I'm a body comp researcher. That's kind of my base training is in body comp assessment. And we all know body composition, important for performance. It's related to performance. There's ranges that are a little more optimal depending on what we're trying to do, favoring different performance. It's not the be all say all, but there's definitely some ranges that benefit the performance. And so menstrual cycle to me is very similar. It's not the be all say all to your performance. There's variability within that, but there might be some subtle differences relative to the individual that we could kind of account for and maybe anticipate and either adjust our training a little bit to account for that, or try to compensate for some of that, or maybe we adjust our nutrition a little bit to try to prevent a negative effect, or take advantage of a more positive effect. And so to me, menstrual cycle is just one more thing we can add to a female athlete profile. If we're checking, monitoring athletes and we're already tracking all these things, it's just one more piece to the bigger puzzle that is where, looking for the red flags or something that, hey, maybe we should just be aware. They're in their luteal phase right now. So just if things are all kind of aligning, hey, that might be something we need to be aware of. So yeah, not the be all say all, but it's just another part of the female athlete profile. So I think what is helpful right now, what I tell most females is just start tracking your cycle. Most females don't right now have access to anything that quantitatively tells them their hormone levels. Most of us have an app. We can track when did I have menstruation. I would encourage then layering on when do I experience certain symptoms, positive and negative. Not all symptoms are negative. A lot of them are. That's the ones we tend to pay more attention to. But maybe when do I feel really, really good? When do I have trouble sleeping? When do I have pain? When do I feel like I was kind of weak? Gosh, my workout felt really hard today. By tracking that consistently, then we can start to say, am I seeing trends in my personal data? So if I'm working with a team and I see one of the girls consistently about every 4 weeks, heart rate's kind of high, seems like she's, got a higher RPE. If that's consistently happening and we're always seeing that late luteal phase light up, okay, might be a sign that, hey, this is a little bit hormonal related. And what are some things we can do to help address that? Is she having trouble sleeping? Does she seem extra stressed with all of that? So does that mean I need to just drop her intensity a little bit? Do I need to encourage a little bit more recovery? Do I need to, hey, let's get a little extra nutrition in to try to compensate for some of that? The cool part to me then, if I know that's coming every single month, what can I do leading up to that now to maybe help lessen that effect that's consistently happening? So does that mean hey, this thing's coming up again. I'm approaching about that time when I always feel extra fatigued or my pain's really bad at this time. Okay, can I up my nutrition a little bit? Can I get a little extra carbs? Is there some supplementation I can take to maybe even prevent that from even happening? Another flag, like another example, we know there's some thermoregulatory differences with that fluctuation in hormones. So let's say it's preseason, we're getting ready to hit that. Soccer athletes are going to be outside, it's hot. Maybe I've got a little bit of a red flag on all my athletes that are in that thermoregulatory compromised kind of phase, and I've just got an extra marker on them saying they might be at a slightly higher risk. Everyone needs to be drinking water. That's not changing. I need to be making sure everyone's hydrating, refueling, electrolytes. That stuff stays the same, but maybe I have those other girls just kind of flagged to say, let's make sure they get a little bit extra, or am I seeing some signs of earlier onset of fatigue that I can help them manage and overcome a little bit. So I think that's how we can utilize some of that. Flip it. I think if I'm noticing maybe performance-wise, I'm feeling really good during certain times, and that's very consistent. Maybe we try to take advantage of some of that a little bit. To me, that's normal coaching. You would do that kind of anyway. Like, they're looking real good today. Let's maybe like milk a little bit more out of this. Do a few more reps, do one more sprint, can we take advantage of feeling good within the programming that we're already doing? So I think it's nothing major, and by no means is it anything to the extent of like, you're in this phase, you should only do yoga. You're in this phase, you should only do sprints. That's not what's recommended. Stick with normal training, and it's just, again, another piece to the puzzle to say, hey, maybe I either need to rest and recover a little bit more, or fuel a little bit better, or hey, we're maybe coming up on a time when I can take a little bit more advantage. So maybe we push our harder block up just a little bit to take advantage of that when we're going to feel good. So again, subtle shifts. It's just one more piece to that athlete profile that we might be able to maximize on a little bit. Yeah.
And then similarly with the use of oral contraceptive or any hormonal contraceptive, you take the same approach.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think their advantage is their hormonal profile is a lot more consistent. So they're probably not going to see the variability in how they feel quite so much. So they may not need to track quite so aggressively like a normal cycling individual.
What about going from an active to the placebo phase, placebo pill?
If they're noticing a switch, they could account for that. Like you said, a lot of them tend to skip that placebo phase, so they would just be riding it out. But if they're seeing a change in how they feel as they swap between those, absolutely, they can try to account for that and maybe make that small adjustment. And just, do I need to get a little extra carbohydrate in, or go to bed 30 minutes, an hour sooner, get an extra snack in the middle of the day? Nothing. It doesn't have to be huge. But any of them can account for that.
This is a little bit of, it's not quite an aside, but it's a little bit different topic, but it's related to menstrual cycle. I've not worked with athletes. I've not worked with female athletes, but, probably like you, we have student athletes in our classes. And I've had a couple of female athletes of the endurance type of stuff. Mm-hmm. And we spent a little bit of time talking about low energy availability, right? Female athlete triad. And at least, this is anecdotal, but at least for me, from the female athletes that have been in my class and we get to these things, they never heard of these things before.
Yeah.
Right. And also the idea of not having a menstrual cycle, or not menstruating, is not atypical. Mm-hmm. Right.
Right.
Can you speak to that? Because I think that's something, especially in sports and athletics, especially if you're dealing with a male dominated coaching, training, type of staff or, background, they're not talking about these things. When like, I don't want to know about, like, but something as, something like not having a normal menstrual cycle and not menstruating, that is not ideal, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, I think the bigger issue, I guess if we want to think about it kind of in terms of, like I compared it to body comp earlier, it's part of a whole athlete's profile. You could also think of these adjustments across the cycle are kind of like supplements. We talk about in nutrition, supplements aren't really an important consideration if we're not hitting our macronutrients, if we're not getting good caloric intake. Like caloric intake, bottom line, we got to do that first. Second line, am I hitting my macros? Then we can layer on the supplements, and maybe supplements help us achieve layers 1 and 2, but those are going to have the bigger impact than the other accessory supplements. So let's not get lost in the weeds of all these little things I could be doing if I'm not doing the big things. And I think that's what it gets lost sometimes. People get excited and are like, oh, can I adjust my training by my cycle? And maybe I need to adjust all my nutrition based on my cycle. And you can, but if you're not getting enough calories, which we know most female athletes probably aren't, if you're not getting enough carbohydrate, which we've got a lot of stats that most aren't, the rest, starts to become a little bit accessory. And so making sure we're hitting those core things, most important. And so not having a cycle means you're pretty far down that scale of things your nutritional needs have not been met for a while. The female body is very sensitive to calories, very sensitive to carbohydrate, and we start to shift pretty quickly when we're not meeting those needs. Very resilient, but by the time you lose the cycle, like you've been trending that direction for a good while, and that's a sign dysfunction has been happening for a little while. And you're just not meeting those baseline needs. And that's where I think it gets hard with how to address that with contraceptive users. When you lose your regular period, to track that, how do you know if you've slid down that scale too far? Now you have to start relying on just measures of, I'm feeling fatigued, I'm not adapting like we would maybe expect. Injuries are popping up, I'm getting sick. But with them, it's harder to pick up on that maybe sooner than later. And we no longer have that anchor point of the cycle's gone because we've kind of erased it. And so I think that's where we're trying to shift. And I think we need to start accounting. A lot of athletes are on a contraception, either to, offset symptomology. They don't want to deal with the bleed. Understandable. You're trying to perform. You don't want one more thing to be worried about. And so when so many athletes are using something like that for valid reasons, just avoiding pregnancy in general, all of that, figuring out how we help make sure they are staying healthy when you lose that very physical change, which I bring this up in class too. That's a very real issue with male athletes too. When you don't have that anchor point of a lost menstrual cycle, identifying maybe low energy gets a little bit trickier. That's one advantage to having a period. When that goes away, that's not a good sign. So, lots to consider there. But I think, like in talking with our director of Olympic nutrition here, like, she's like, my biggest issue, we're just getting athletes to eat enough and the appropriate amount and carbohydrates. We're just trying to build that piece most of the time. And I think that's going to be the average individuals. Like, that's where let's get those things in line first, and then we can worry about the nuanced pieces.
Yeah. Okay. That was great. That was great. I want to ask one last thing because I don't want to have this conversation without also including another population that, yourself and Abby make a
Mhm.
point to bring in when you do talk about these things is the perimenopausal and postmenopausal population.
Yeah.
So in
Yeah.
terms of training considerations or changes throughout those periods, um, what is your take, perspective, considerations with that?
Yeah. Gosh, if you want to talk about a forgotten group, it's those poor perimenopausal women. Um,
And I only have that in mind because of you and Abby. So thank you for that.
yes. Gosh, there's already not a lot of data on just women in general, but perimenopause, it's really scarce. And those women are going through some very big changes. And I think what's been cool, I honestly like attribute to some of the push for more female data to those women going through that right now. Um, if you think about like Title IX happened 50-ish years ago. And so you saw that rise in women in sport. They all want to keep competing, and now it's hard and different and challenging, and they're feeling the effects of that hormone change and realizing that nobody knows what the heck's going on, and they're asking the questions. And so I really think some of that has helped push that to the surface a little bit. But yeah, they because the hormones are in just such turmoil and fluctuation, and your body's changing and not responding like it normally would. I think there's a lot of questions on how do we maximize that, do that. And so a couple of things we've started to explore, like Abby and I have looked a lot into how do we help preserve muscle and prevent loss of muscle that tends to happen during that time. At the same time, how do we prevent, there's this rise in body fat that tends to happen. It especially shifts more to the stomach region. No woman likes that very much, that gain in belly fat. And so trying to sort through as those hormones change, what can we do? Kind of from what we've seen is there's a greater development maybe of some anabolic resistance happening during that time. So your body, your muscle, because it's in such a hormonal turmoil, the way I think of it is there's just higher inflammation happening. You're hitting these highs and lows. Overall, estrogen's dropping, things that typically help female muscle, causing a lot of metabolic turbulence. So how you're using carbs and fats is changing. And so what tends to happen, a lot of women go to steady state, maybe moderate to low intensity exercise, which is wonderful. Do that, be consistent, great for your heart, but not great for stimulating muscle, not the most effective for maybe some of the body comp changes during that time. And so we've seen some cool stuff with like interval training and making sure we're lifting heavy weights. Weights are going to be your best muscle stimulus. Definitely going to help overcome some of that muscle loss, that muscle resistance. Doing higher intensity only has to be a couple days a week, but trying to really push those muscles makes a really big difference as far as helping to maintain that muscle mass. And so with that also, pushing a little bit higher protein intake is going to help overcome some of that. So that's a lot of where we focused. I think we need to know a whole lot more. Symptomology gets really bad during that time, and it's wildly variable. And so if someone's experiencing hot flashes, that's super disruptive to exercise and training. If you're going through a lot of fatigue, that makes it hard to exercise. That makes it hard to go hard and fast. And that's the last thing you want to do. So there's an example of maybe we really adjust our training based on where we're at that day. Maybe those are the days we do the easier stuff just to make sure we're moving. But do what you can. And then the days you feel great, let's maybe try to take advantage and go a little harder that day if we can. I think I'm very interested in how can we maximize some of our supplements through this time. What's kind of wild to me, a lot of women going through that time period, they're like kind of peak career, family life, community involvement, juggling a lot mentally, doing it all. So how do we, if you're having a lot of brain fog and exhaustion, and how can we help you like get the nutrition you need, some extra carbs, or get that protein, or how do we use maybe some of our nootropics to help offset some of that and really help women not be just functioning, but like thriving, and feel a whole lot better. I think a lot just accept it as this is just what happens. And yeah, to me, that's just not acceptable anymore. Even like hormonal therapies and treatments, there's wildly different schools of thought of, do we give estrogen? Do we give progesterone? Do we treat this, that, or the other? How much? So I think we need a lot more research in those perimenopausal women specifically, to back up a little bit. A lot of the research is either those young, healthy pre-menopause, 18 to 30-ish, or we go to the far other end of the spectrum and say 65 and older, or even 70 and older, 75 and older. But from what a lot of the work like Abby's done, there's a lot happening in that perimenopausal time. And as we all know, if we can, it's easier to prevent decline than it is to try to reverse a decline. And so trying to help those women get through that time period a little bit better with a little bit less drop in that health and disease risks. Now have we set them up for that whole big last chunk of life to really keep performing. Those are some of my favorite athletes. It's been so cool at the Olympics to see women now performing post-pregnancy well into 40s, 50s. I forget how old. There's an equestrian rider who medaled the other day, maybe in her 50s or 60s, which is really cool to see that. I love the like senior Olympics. There's a 90-year-old that she like does every event. It's amazing. I love that kind of stuff. So yeah, how do we just keep them active and healthy? I think, yeah, that time needs, if you want something to study, you can throw a dart and it probably needs to be looked at. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. Somewhat related to that, I work with older adults.
Yeah.
A lot of my clients are female, 50s, 60s, most of them 70s.
Yeah.
And, to your point of, some might have the idea of like just accepting it and kind of, I don't say giving up, but maybe not pursuing exercise or being active as much as they would have when they were younger. Yeah, you definitely, even at the ages that I am working with people, in your older decades, older years, generally your function will go down, right? Tends to decline.
Yeah.
But if you do stay active and consistent, even if you start late, because some of the clients I have, they first started being active when they started with me, say 5 years ago. But if you compare individuals of their same age, maybe their same start point, of someone who has been consistently active and trained over 4 or 5 years, compared to someone who has not, I mean, instead of going this way, you're going this way, right? And that sets you up not only just for now, but for the next years, decades of your life, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
It's amazing. When we did some really cool high intensity interval training studies during my PhD. And I think those older individuals were actually some of our like favorite success stories. individuals that came in very hunched over, very shuffle step, left our study 8 weeks, 12 weeks later, walking so much more confidently, no longer using a cane, trying to run. They went from like, I could never to like, maybe I'll try. I think it was all it was like cool for us to see, and you like really feel like you're making a difference. But I also think empowering for them to say, hey, this thing I couldn't do, now I can do. And where's the limit now if I could do that? So I think, yeah, those were some of my favorite people that we got to work with.
For sure. For sure. Okay. There is one last thing that I'd like to do. Okay.
Yeah.
I want to do it's not quite a meme review because they're not really memes. I tried to look for some and it sent me to TikTok.
Okay.
So we're going to the depths of hell with TikTok. Okay.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
What do we got?
So I want to show you a couple of TikToks, get your professional scientific PhD perspective on it. Okay.
Okay.
And also to add, I know like this whole conversation or topic could be ripe for like low brow commentary, right?
Sure.
Right. So one, in this conversation, I don't want that, right? I don't want to put that out there. And then two, when I was looking for some of these things, I stayed away from some of that potential lowbrow type of stuff. Okay.
Yep.
So I tried to get some that were humorous, but also not distasteful. So you can let me know how I did. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So the first one, let me know what you think about this one.
To be honest, I feel that in my soul, but but I think this is a good example. So, I mean, I joke with my friends all the time. We'll be like going through things like that, and you're just like, oh, what's happening? And then, period starts the next day, and you're like, oh, why did I forget about that again? But I think so. Something to take from that, though, like some people will see that, and again, blanket statement that happens for every female, and that's not necessarily true. You may experience some of those things, you may not experience some of those things. Maybe you experience one or two, but not all of them. They don't always all come together. It is interesting. I think we're seeing more and more, if you really like look at the data collectively and try to look at some of the trends, it does seem that your symptomology and what's happening around menstruation, the days leading up to it and the days following, maybe like a plus or minus 7 days, tends to be where maybe the most impacts are happening, because that's the time where we see the most like symptomology. So depending on how severe your symptoms are, can definitely impact it. But she's also just exercising through it, so doesn't mean you have to stop training.
Right. Okay. This one I'm interested in.
So this one, how do I want to say this? Kind of like taking everything to the extreme, making it all very glamorized is how I tend to call it. But some of those things might happen. That's not going to happen for everybody. Some people feel great during that phase. So definitely those things have been documented to happen for sure, but they make it sound like that's going to be for everybody. And that's definitely not true.
Yeah. And I think that's sort of the biggest downside or drawback to things like this. And, of course, it's a TikTok or like an Instagram post or, even like a podcast or podcast clip of, there might be some information that does ring true, but within the context of how it's presented, you don't really get a more full, thorough description of what the actual reality is related to that.
Yes, agreed. And that's the issue with a lot of this. And I talk about that in my class with my students. In today's world, you've got 2 seconds to get somebody's attention and 18 seconds to get the message across. So how do you do that effectively, accurately? Usually, when you take it to an extreme, that catches people's attention. People like extremes, not middle ground. So I think that's a cool area, is how do we best communicate these things in an accurate way, knowing that this is how most people get their information.
Right. And that's why we've been talking for almost 2 hours.
Exactly.
But with that, if we got 2 seconds to get people's attention, what you doing with those 2 seconds?
Yep.
No, what are you doing?
Oh, what am I doing?
Yeah.
So I'm trying to figure out what the heck I'm doing.
Okay. All right.
But I think that's where, visually, can you capture their attention? You got to have that capture piece. But then once you've got them, can you, smooth it out? Not make it.
What if you dabbed? What if you dabbed? I don't even know if the kiss.
Invitation to my gangster
Is that what the kids do now?
I don't even know. Maybe like 5 years ago. All right. Well, Katie, hey, again, thank you very much for the time and being open to talking with me. I was looking forward to it. Like I said, I was looking forward to getting a chance to talk to you about this early on. So I think this is a really good conversation. I learned a lot. Hopefully the people that are watching this will learn a lot, both from a research perspective, like other researchers, that might be interested in studying this, or people that previously had shied away from researching females just because they thought it was too hard. And then also providing good, solid information for practitioners or people that just female athletes or female people that train. So
I
want to thank you again for your time.
Me. Thanks for letting me just talk for a while.
If you're talking science, I'm all about it.
Awesome.
Okay. Do you have any social media that you want to plug or put out, or MySpace?
Yeah, I don't post a lot, but you can find me on Instagram. I think it's Katie Hirsch PhD. I'm on Twitter, Hirsch Katie. And
TikTok?
Otherwise, don't hesitate to reach out.
No TikTok.
No TikTok.
No, we're in our 30s.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, Katie, thanks again. I appreciate it, and looking forward to seeing you in the future and talking. So,
same. Thanks so much.
All right.